Welcome, you're on The Fringe Show. I'm your host, Tatiana Zalan, and I go live every Friday, 2 p.m. Dubai time. It didn't happen last Friday because I had some internet connection, so I'm doing this as a recording. Why should you be listening to The Fringe? The Fringe helps you to navigate the rapidly changing world and improve the odds of your success. Here we talk about technology, startups, and mental models of successful people so that you too can take advantage of the opportunities in the new digital world. Today, I will be talking about transhumanism or human augmentation, whatever you want to call it. And this has recently been a very hot topic in policymaking, technology, and even religious circles. It's a very large topic, so it won't be possible to cover it in one go. And I decided to split it in at least two parts, and maybe there will be a third part as well. But in this first episode dedicated to this topic of transhumanism, I will talk about what transhumanism is, how we define it, its milestones, history, and also the ancient roots of this movement. And in the next episode, I will talk about the implications of transhumanism for us, mere mortals, living today in the 21st century. Just a disclaimer before we go any further, I'm not your investment or financial advisor or health advisor, and this show is just for informational and educational purposes only. I will, as usual, use some quotes, and I will be drawing on very in-depth research by three scholars, very reputable scholars of Roberto Mazzocco, Joseph Farrell, and Scott DeHart, who dedicated a lot of time to studying this topic. And just to start with, why is this interest in transhumanism? Just recently, there was a conference in Vatican on transhumanism that was at the end of October this year. Now, human augmentation is also on the agenda of various NGOs, and particularly the World Economic Forum. And implicitly, this is also behind the metaverse hype. You probably would have heard about with the corporate transformation of Facebook to a metaverse-focused company. I actually had a show on that as well, not that long time ago. And our senses are all influenced by VR, virtual reality, and perhaps that can also influence our thoughts, our feelings and emotions. All of these can be altered by technology. Hopefully in the show, I will give you a balanced view of transhumanism or human augmentation, some people prefer to call it. There are some appealing parts in it, to me appealing, but there are also parts that I find quite revolting about this whole movement and the philosophy. So let's start with what is transhumanism. If you look at Encyclopedia Britannica, it's defining transhumanism as a social and philosophical movement devoted to the research and development of robust human enhancement technologies. Transhumanists, enthusiasts, give it a range of interpretations of this definition. What they have in common is a belief that in technology as a means to improve human capabilities, physical, intellectual, but also emotional and sometimes moral. Some even suggest that it's not just a possibility, but in fact desirability of using technology to transform human nature itself. And let me give you an informal definition of transhumanism, which is coming from a document called The Transhumanist FAQ, from Frequently Asked Questions, a general introduction that was posted in 2003 by Nick Bostrom. And Nick Bostrom is one of them co-founders of the World Transhumanist Association. Yes, believe it or not, association like that exists. So what is transhumanism according to them? Transhumanism is a way of thinking about the future that is based on the premise that the human species in its current form does not represent the end of our development, but rather a comparatively early phase. We're formally defined as follows. the intellectual and cultural movement that affirms the possibility and desirability of fundamentally improving the human condition through applied reason, especially by developing and making widely available technologies to eliminating aging and to greatly enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological aspects. So that's first. And second, the study of the ramifications, promises, and potential dangers of technologies that will enable us to overcome fundamental human limitations, and the related study of the ethical matters involved in developing and using such technologies. So it's both a movement and a study of this movement, which makes sense. In the case of transhumanism, using technology to change human nature is just a new, improved version of genetic mutation, it would seem. And rather than being random, like in Darwin's theory of evolution, it is quite intentional. And I think that's a very important distinction worth drawing out. Man is being able to remake himself in whatever image he wants. Now let's have a look at the recent history of transhumanism. Apparently, in the recent history, some trace it to the human potential movement, which was in the 60s in the US, and the 70s and 80s in particular saw the birth and growth of the real futurist subculture. That gave rise to different organizations, which were definitely on the fringe of the dominant culture. These groups at the beginning tended to be quite isolated from one another, and although they were sort of ideologically similar, they didn't have a common ideology. The first self-proclaimed transhumanist activists began to meet formally at the University of California, Los Angeles, so UCLA, during the 80s, and this university would soon become the main center of transhumanist thinking. I quite believe it remains like so today. In 1986, there was an epoch-making year for transhumanists. Eric Drexler published Engines of Creation. And in this book, he spoke about the possibility of building so-called nanomachines, computerized robots as small as viruses or proteins that are capable of manipulating matter at the atomic and molecular level. If this were possible, then these nanomachines would allow transhumanists to realize all of their dreams, from physical immortality to the resuscitation of bodies stored in liquid nitrogen. Another milestone was in 1988 when the roboticist and transhumanist scholar Hans Moravec published Mind Children. He discussed the forthcoming development of intelligent machines, another important piece of transhumanism. And also in the same year, the Englishman, or rather Californian philosopher, Max More, published the first issue of Extropy magazine. Extropy represents a concept which is contrary to entropy. Transhumanists pursue a growth of order rather than chaos. Entropy means really chaos. This was followed in 1992 by the foundation of the Extropy Institute. In 1998, two British philosophers, Nick Bostrom and David Pease, they were very well recognized and very reputable scholars, founded the World Transhumanist Association. It was the first world organization aimed at spreading transhumanist ideas to every corner of the globe and across political spectrum. California has become the hub of transhumanist movement. From the second half of 2000s, transhumanists began to take root more and more in Silicon Valley. For example, in 2007, the World Transhumanist Association established its headquarters in Palo Alto, and several other organizations with similar ideas flourished in that area. Why California, you would ask? Why is it the hub? Well, it probably goes back to its cultural roots. In the 90s, witnessed the development of the so-called California ideology, a social phenomenon which represented a mixture of hippie rebellion and economic neoliberalism and techno-utopianism. And now in Silicon Valley, we can find practically all of the main think tanks that gravitate towards all these transhumanist ideals. There is a Foresight Institute, the Lifeboat Foundation, the Singularity Institute, various social networks, conferences, exhibitions. They all take place in Silicon Valley. Aubrey de Grey, who is a renowned theoretician of biological immortality, often holds meetings at the offices of Yahoo and Google. So all of that is happening. That, by the way, that's coming from research by Roberta Manzocco. What is the philosophy of behind transhumanism? This particular piece is coming more from research by Farrell and DeHart. Farrell and DeHart studied a lot of ancient myths and texts across all religious traditions and even before religions to understand this phenomenon. And they've finally traced this idea of transhumanism to the Philosophia Perennis. That's a very ancient doctrine, and that means that the man is the microcosm of the universe. Thus, to dominate the universe, you need to dominate man, and to dominate man, one must really dominate and control the input to all his senses. It's sight and hearing and touch and smell and taste, finally his sexuality and even consciousness itself. Farrell and DeHart refer to this as the alchemical agenda. So transformation of man in the past, or transformation of matter, used to be associated with all sorts of alchemical activities. And they draw these parallels between the alchemical agenda and modern science of technology. And you only need to look for evidence in the following areas, like domination of sight through all the media and sensory input, be it art or architecture, and importantly, all media of information. It could be literature and very lately film and television. Also domination of sound through music and speech, and domination of man's taste, particularly his food. All these techniques and technologies, they claim, are ultimately associated with social engineering or alchemical transformation of man. And arguably, this scientific tinkering will enhance humanity by a vast expansion of consciousness and knowledge. And we will explore this question, whether transhumanism does indeed enhance consciousness and knowledge. And they saw the practical implementation of this technology, or rather of this philosophy, in three areas. So man is the microcosm of the universe, and so it's all about the fusion of man with animals and plants and minerals. Let's look at these three areas one by one. Firstly, fusion of man and animal. Is it happening? Yes, it does. Consider this article in particular. It's from 2005 that I've got here. It's from National Geographic News, and it's entitled Animal-Human Hybrids Spark Controversy. So that was published in National Geographic News. And they talk about such experiments as Chinese scientists at the Shanghai Second Medical University in 2003 successfully fusing human cells with rabbit eggs. Arguably, that was the very first manifestation of the human-animal chimeras successfully created, so that these embryos were this first manifestation. These embryos were allowed to develop for several days in a laboratory dish before the scientists destroyed all the embryos and harvested the stem cells. In 2004, the Minnesota researchers at the Mayo Clinic created pigs with human blood flowing through their bodies. And scientists at Stanford University, about the same time, were planning to experiment with creating mice with human brains. And scientists, while doing these experiments, feel that the more human-like the animal, the better research model it makes for, say, testing drugs or possibly growing spare parts, such as livers, to transplant them into humans afterwards. So what about man and his food, man and vegetable? The idea that a certain kind of sacred food will result in transformation of mankind humankind is as old as the ancient texts like the Vedas and the Old Testament. The idea is that this special knowledge will lead either to immortality or conversely to death, maybe. So for the total alchemical transformation of man, both his body and his extended body, like the world, society, and the environment in which he lives, all of these things must also be transformed, and including everything that enters into him or into the body, and namely a man's food. The Mayans, for example, are very well known for attempting to practice a version of the fusion of plant and human by fertilizing their cornfields with the blood of their human sacrificial victims at a point in time. This whole, in more recent years, so that's old, that's ancient. What about more recent years? Well, we'll see that through that agenda of genetic engineering of food and other social engineering methods, including various methods of manipulation of the food supply. And genetic manipulation of food has been supported by many different NGOs and foundations, and these foundations for millions of dollars in the research of genetic modification of food in the 1980s. Let me give you just a couple of examples of how it really happened. You probably know that in the past, say, if we take Asian farmers, their agriculture was pretty much traditional, but with the advent of genetic engineering, these farmers were drawn into this global market for fertilizers, high-yielding seeds and pesticides and mechanization and irrigation and credit and marketing schemes, and all of that was supported by Western agribusiness. The reasons for that, it would seem, were very, very simple. It's patent law. Because seeds, for example, could no longer be kept from one season to another because they were patented, being genetically modified. Another example, Iraq is historically part of ancient Mesopotamia. It's the cradle of civilization, where for millennia people farmed on this fertile land, and that created ideal conditions for crop cultivation. And Iraqi farmers, and the farming itself, if you look back at the histories, it's all probably 8,000 years before Christ started to develop, and they developed the rich seeds of almost every variety of wheat in the world today. And their historic and valuable seed bank was utterly destroyed as a result of the Iraqi war. In other words, if we look at transhumanism from this perspective, man and food, genetic engineering of food was a means to an end, the end of gaining patent rights over plants being used in agricultural production. And it was a means of the social transformation of humankind. There is a possibility, it is a remote possibility, but it's still a possibility, and that's raised by all genetic engineering, that the genetic modification of engineering foods might actually modify the genetic makeup of humankind itself. And that in turn will lead to the following possibility. If the engineered genes are patented, then human so modified may be considered the IP of the corporations that produce this modification. And it's not a crazy idea. We'll discuss it probably in the second show as well. For example, I'm sure you would have heard about that the future of vaccines, according to some, may look more like eating a salad than getting a shot in your arm. And that's precisely what University of California scientists are studying right now, whether they can turn edible plants like lettuce and other salads into mRNA vaccine factories. That's going on. Now, the last bit in this puzzle, fusing man and minerals, or rather MantoMachine. So here the idea is to transform man, and to do that specifically by creating this techno-androgynous fusion of man and machine. And it's nowhere more visible, this whole idea of transhumanism, that in the concept of singularity. One of the main proponents of that is Ray Kurzweil. He thinks that by the year of 2045, we will experience the greatest technological singularity in the history of humankind, the kind that would, in a few years, alter and overturn even all the institutions and pillars of our society and completely change the way that we view ourselves as human beings. We'll all get to singularity, but by creating a superhuman artificial intelligence. And it's the kind of artificial intelligence of that level that could conceive ideas that human beings are not able of conceiving. Transhumanists call these technologies that are key to creation, if you will, the Grin. It's an acronym and stands for genetic, robotic, information processing, and nanotechnological processes. So it's Grin. Ray Kurzweil, in particular, one of the leading thinkers exploring these possibilities, believes that the technologies would ultimately merge our biological thinking with non-biological intelligence. That is, the human intelligence itself is transformed, or human consciousness rather. The possibility exists also for our non-biological intelligence component, and it will be trillions of times more powerful than our biological component. And he's very much into talking about downloading and uploading memories and direct modification of consciousness and behavior. So Kurzweil sees the possibility that entire individual brains could be scanned to upload an individual's personality and memories into a new body. And if a new body wears out, then gives rise to the possibility of extreme biological longevity to a particular individual if we, instead of prolonging the life of an individual, we grow or harvest, transplant organs from old bodies and maybe from animals as well. Nanomachines would also contribute to life extension simply by repairing deceased cells or tissues. Is this happening? Is this vision being realized? Yes, it is. For example, the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Science, which is based in Munich, Germany, has already engineered a computer chip that allows human neurons to be grown on a computer chip and directly interfering with it, so interacting, both human neurons and the computer chip are interacting. And I'm sure most of you would have heard about Elon Musk's Neuralink, which is a high bandwidth brain implant that can communicate with phones and computers. So as we can see, this is happening as well. And before I conclude, just a couple of parting thoughts. So as we've seen before here, is that this transhumanist agenda, or you may call it human augmentation, is nothing new. It's not something recent. It's going back to very ancient times. It has got ancient roots. But the big questions for any person of faith, if you will, is would rejecting the nature with which we are endowed by our Creator bring universal happiness and well-being? We'll explore this question further on. And the second question is it moral, is it ethical to go against the order of nature designed by our Creator? And you can call Creator the universe, the source, the field, or God, some people would call it, whatever it may mean. But is it okay? Is it moral to sort of try to reject this nature? Well, I'll leave you with these couple of questions that we will certainly explore in the next show. Thank you for joining, and I shall see you on the Fringe Show next Friday at 2 p.m. Dubai time. Now, sometimes for some music.